we've got this ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. It's just taken effect, but this is not the end of the story. This is going to be, you could call it a fragile opening act. So I'm going to walk you through what the agreement actually contains in detail, what's expected to follow in the coming days and weeks, and the high stakes variables that are at play here, why President Trump did not win the Nobel Peace Prize, even though this was a very big feather in his cap for sure. Planned visit on Monday to Israel. Over the weekend, he's coming. He's going to be addressing the Knesset on Sunday.
Last night, we reached a momentous breakthrough in the Middle East, something that people said was never going to be done. We ended the war in Gaza and really, on a much bigger basis, created peace. And I think it's going to be a lasting peace, hopefully an everlasting peace. Peace in the Middle East, and we secured the release of all of the remaining hostages, and they should be released on Monday or Tuesday.
So he's hoping it's an everlasting peace. Of course, we all hope for an everlasting peace. We pray for peace in Jerusalem. That might be a little optimistic, but everybody is certainly grateful to President Trump. As a matter of fact, the J Post put a picture of President Trump on its cover. There are pictures, billboards going up all over Jerusalem and all over Israel with President Trump's picture saying, "Thank you, President Trump, for what you did to get this done." President Trump, by not encouraging Hamas, by standing behind Israel, by giving Israel the things that they needed to win, by helping Israel strike down Iran and encouraging them in terms of what they were doing in Yemen by helping with that, and in Syria and in Lebanon as well. President Trump made great strides toward bringing a conclusion to this war. Now, it's important for us to go back at this juncture and talk about the cost, especially for the Israeli people. Here's the aftermath of what parts of Gaza look like. This is Rafah, by the way, and this is exactly what Hamas wanted. They knew this was going to happen. Hamas knew that it doesn't matter how badly Gaza gets destroyed, the world is going to step up and give them money to replace it with all new stuff. And you're going to see that in the days and weeks to come. You're going to see countries around the world pumping money into Gaza, and that money will be used to rebuild what Israel destroyed. You can bet that some of that money is going to come from the American taxpayer, just because we just end up paying for everything. Now, this is the Wikipedia page about casualties of the Gaza war. And I want to point out one thing, because it shows, as of October 7th, 2025, that'd be just 3 days ago, they show 68,172 Palestinians have been killed. But let's look at the Israelis that have died in this war as part of the Hannibal Directive. And this is something that I've talked about several times before. The Hannibal Directive just basically says that Israel has to prioritize the security of its country. And if it looks like their country is being overrun, that they have to employ whatever violence to stop that. Even the enemy is using Israelis as human shields. So what they're saying is, we're not going to use the fact that there are Israelis in the way being held hostage, not going to let that limit us on what we do to protect our country. It's not, as some people think, Israel's plan to wipe out its own people. I've never understood how you could believe that. 46 people have died on the Lebanese border, many of those from rockets and missiles that have been sent across. 3 Israelis have died in Alexandria, Egypt. They were tourists. 2 embassy staff members died in Washington, D.C. in the United States. You remember that shooting. 24 civilians, Israelis, have died in the West Bank in Israel. 29 in the 2024 Iran-Israel conflict and the Iran-Israel war, including 2 that died indirectly. 2 people have been killed by hundreds of Houthi missile and drone attacks. They've shot so many missiles and drones, and most of them don't even make it to Israel, but they have gotten lucky twice and killed 2 Israeli civilians with that. Then on top of the civilian deaths, we've got 961 total security forces that died, including 881 Israeli Defense Force soldiers, 70 Israeli police officers, 10 Shin Bet personnel, and not including those who were also IDF soldiers. We've got about 460 something IDF troops that have died in the fighting in Gaza alone, but the total, including the number of Israeli troops that died on October 7th, comes to 961 total security forces killed. Number one, the longest war Israel has ever fought. Number two, very costly war in terms of men and materiel and economic losses for Israel. However, now let's go back and look at the total number of dead in Gaza alone. Now, the total number of dead in Gaza is harder to come up with because, again, the only numbers that we're being given are from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas. That makes it difficult because there could be people that are still trapped in the rubble someplace. So, again, it's harder to tell. But let's take GHF at their word. Let's talk about that. If the IDF killed 68,000 or 70,000 people, number one, it goes to show that it's not profitable to attack Israel because Israel lost 1,000 or 2,000 total or something. And the numbers are just wildly skewed in terms of that. Now, Israel says that they have cataloged more than 20,000, I think it's closer to 25,000 militants that have been killed. These are people that they took out in the act of fighting Israel, resisting Israel, people who were armed, people who were shooting at Israelis. Israel at first left the bodies out there, but later on they decided if Palestinians can use bodies as leverage, so can we. So they started collecting the dead and storing them in Israel. And now some of those are going to get returned. For every deceased Israeli hostage that is returned, they're going to get like 35 Palestinian fighters given back to the Palestinians. The Gaza war recorded the lowest civilian to combat ratio in modern warfare. Despite being fought under some of the most difficult and complex battlefield conditions any military has ever faced, Israel's forces confronted a literal underground war machine, a vast network of tunnels and command centers deliberately built beneath residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and mosques. To make matters worse, the enemy's combatants never wore uniforms. They intentionally blurred the line between civilians and fighters. That's against the Geneva Conventions. They located their military sites inside hospitals, schools, mosques, and children's centers and things like that. Again, in contravention of the Geneva Conventions. So the harsh reality is that a large portion of the civilian population supported what Hamas was doing and still to this day supports their ideology. They gladly served as human shields, informants, and helped with the logistics of sustaining Hamas's terror operations. Despite this, Israel's leadership has often chosen to absorb further losses of their own troops, greater military losses for the IDF, rather than risk civilian casualties among an enemy that's deeply embedded within its own people. This policy, which is shaped by elitist academics and policymakers who are detached from the battlefield and the realities of Jewish life, has come at a devastating cost to Israelis. There are literally hundreds of Israeli troops that are dead today simply because Israel decided to hold itself to a much higher standard. The ceasefire enters effect last night, so the hostilities are paused. Israeli withdrawal from Gaza is going to be to designated lines, and Trump will visit Israel Sunday. And during the trip, he's slated to meet not just with the prime minister, but with the families of the hostages. He's also expected to address the Knesset on Sunday. He'll be there for about 24 hours. The Jerusalem Post is reporting that Hamas agreed to the deal after being convinced that retaining the hostages had become a burden. Who were they a burden to? Now, I mentioned this in my podcast a couple days ago. This is speculation on my part. This has not been reported, but I'm just reading between the lines here. Somebody had to put pressure on Hamas to do this. And I think there were a lot of somebodies. I think Qatar and Egypt, and I think also Iran was putting pressure on Hamas. I think in reality, the remaining hostages had become a burden more to Iran and to Qatar than they had been to Hamas. Now, Hamas was seeing the writing on the wall as Israel pushed into Gaza City. They knew that they were going to lose the hostages one way or the other, and that the hostages were likely going to be killed in the fight for Gaza City or rescued. And either way, that would be bad for Hamas. So the calculus started to shift because of the military pressure and the diplomatic pressure. They said, really, the best thing we can do with these hostages at this point is to give them back and make ourselves look magnanimous. We get to survive because Israel will agree to stop killing us. So if we don't give the hostages back, Israel's going to continue killing us until they've wiped us out as much as possible. So if there's any chance of survival, this is the only chance. So moving on, the polls in Israel, what do they think about it? Obviously, Israelis are super happy about what's been announced. They are cautious because the hostages have not been released yet. They're expecting them to be released by about noon on Monday, because that would be the 72 hours from when the deal was signed. And they're cautious. Why? Because Hamas has done this before, where they use the hostages for psychological torture of the Israeli people. They're hoping it's going to go down like they say it will. Now, Israel has agreed as part of the first phase of this deal to pull back to this area here on the map. The area in yellow will be the area that Israel continues to hold. And so essentially, Gaza has just gotten a lot smaller. And think of it like what happened after the Oslo Accords in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. They have A zones, B zones, and C zones. They have in Judea and Samaria these A zones, which are controlled by the Palestinian Authority and are policed by the Palestinian Authority. No Israeli government in there. The B zones are administered by the Palestinian Authority, but are protected by the IDF because they're transition spaces where Israeli citizens have to move through to get to the C zones where they live. In the C zones, Israelis can live there, and it is administered and also protected by the IDF. So now in Gaza, we're going to have essentially the brown area, the small brown area along the coast there, is going to be an A zone. There's going to be no Israeli troops or presence in there. Then the yellow area will be like a B zone, and then some parts of that will actually be even like a C zone where there will be no Palestinians allowed to go at all. And it will be completely, for the time being, administered and protected by the IDF. And they are going to stay in 58% of the Gaza Strip until Hamas has been completely dismantled. Now, here's where things might break down with this ceasefire, because some of this is ambiguous. They haven't drawn out yet exactly which parts of Gaza Israel will withdraw from, what buffer zones will be in place, or what control zones Israel will keep after Hamas is dismantled. So they've also not quite worked out yet who will assume security and policing authority in Gaza after the complete withdrawal. It won't be Hamas. It won't be the Palestinian Authority, most likely. It'll most likely be something of an international effort or some hybrid force. Now, in the initial phase, part of the agreement is that they'll put together an international peacekeeping force that will include U.S. troops. And so there'd been a lot of reporting that U.S. troops were going to be on the ground, boots on the ground in Gaza, which would not be popular with Americans, but that's not actually the case. President Trump is going to send about 200 U.S. troops to Israel, and they're going to establish a center just outside the Gaza Strip to help with the handover, to help with the transition. There's been no mention of removing the up to 2,000 U.S. troops that are already serving in Israel in a defensive capacity, watching the skies with radar, manning the missile batteries, the THAAD missile batteries that are down there in the Negev and places like that. There are a couple thousand U.S. troops on the ground in Israel that have been there for more than a year. Okay, so they still have to work out the actual mechanism for verifying the hostages for Hamas, getting the hostages out, because they have said that there are some that are missing, at least the dead ones. They can't find all of the deceased Israeli hostages. And so there's going to have to be a mechanism for allowing Hamas to search areas that are under IDF control without the IDF killing them, without clashes there. They still have to work out how the aid distribution is going to take place. They've said that they're going to open up the aid crossings, and apparently even the Rafah crossing is going to open up with Egypt. But how that reconstruction and aid distribution, border crossing control, and the resource allocation is going to be governed has yet to be worked out. So, what can we expect in the coming days and weeks? These hostage exchanges begin hopefully Saturday, Sunday, Monday. As soon as they get under IDF control, they check them out and see if there are any immediate medical needs that need to be met for them to be able to survive to get to the hospital. Then, if they are in critical condition, they'll put them in a helicopter and fly them right to the Soroka Hospital in Beersheba and treat them there. If they're in better condition and they're ambulatory or whatever, they're not in a critical condition, they will actually drive them to the border of Gaza to a transition center that they have set up and will allow them to have a brief meeting with their family members to reunite them. And as they get checked out there, they will be sent to the hospital. The critical condition ones, their families will meet them at the Soroka Hospital. So the coordination center that the U.S. troops are going to be putting together is to help manage the flow of aid, is to track compliance with the ceasefire, and to mediate any disputes. That's where the U.S. troops come in. Trump, as I said, is going to address the Knesset and meet with Netanyahu and the families of the hostages. This trip is symbolic and strategic. Political fallout in Israel. Netanyahu is rising in the polls. He is obviously riding high on this. This is a victory. They've actually accomplished one of the two major goals of the invasion, and that was to get their hostages back, and at least they will have accomplished it if the hostages get released. He may call snap elections, try to stabilize his grip on power. A lot of Israelis are upset about this. They're saying this is a very bitter pill to swallow for them. Why? Because as a part of the deal, Israel is having to turn over 2,000 Palestinian murderers, prisoners, who have murdered 20 or 30 Israelis. And so there may be some backlash over that on the Israeli government. I know Ben Gvir yesterday was ranting at Steve Witkoff about this, and it is what it is. This is what they've agreed to do. The good thing is, once Israel gets its hostages back, then in reality, they are free to continue striking Hamas. What Israel is free to do is to continue striking at threats to its safety, even after the ceasefire takes effect. For example, if they see heavily armed groups of Hamas fighters moving around in Gaza, they can drone strike those guys and take them out. So they are going to continue striking at Hamas if and when they see a reason to do so. And that does not constitute a ceasefire violation. As a matter of fact, Amir Tsarfati had pointed out that the United States had given guarantees to Israel that they could go back to striking Hamas if Hamas poses a threat. Is this the end? I think the war is not completely over. There is no ceasefire with the Houthis. The Houthis are still firing drones and missiles at Israel. So there's going to be more bombs going off in Yemen. There may be more fighting directly with Iran. The United States still has built up forces over there. There is still a possibility of a kinetic conflict between Israel and Iran. There is likely to be more shooting going on against Hezbollah because Israel is still committed to dismantling Hezbollah. There are still going to be more raids and operations that take place in Judea and Samaria. And we might see more in Syria as well. It's not completely over. This is a fragile thing here. But for today, at least, I think we can call this a win in Israel's column. 80% plus of all the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. Israel is not committed to pulling out completely from Gaza until Hamas is disarmed and disbanded. They've offered asylum or safe passage to Hamas if they want to go to Turkey or some other country that'll have them. There's nothing stopping Israel from finishing the job. And so I think that this is likely to continue for some time.